Let us begin our journey into the world of medieval wealth by clearing away the myths that Hollywood has planted in our heads. The truth is that rich people in the Middle Ages lived in a way that was far more comfortable, colorful, and sophisticated than most of us imagine. They were not constantly covered in mud, nor did they sleep in freezing stone cells with rats nibbling at their toes. In fact, the upper classes of Europe from the year 500 to the year 1500 enjoyed a standard of living that would surprise even a modern tourist. Their castles and manor houses were not merely military outposts, but sprawling residential complexes designed for luxury and display. A wealthy baron's home might have dozens of rooms, each serving a specific purpose that we would recognize today. There were private bedchambers with heavy curtains to keep out drafts and prying eyes. There were solar rooms where the lady of the house could sew, read, or manage the household accounts in peace. There were great halls with towering ceilings and massive fireplaces that burned entire oak logs throughout the winter. And let us not forget the chapels, which were often decorated with gold leaf and painted murals of saints and angels. The windows in these chapels were filled with stained glass that cost a small fortune to produce and install. Glass itself was so expensive that only the richest families could afford it for more than a single room. Most ordinary people lived in huts with wooden shutters that let in the wind and the rain. But the wealthy installed lead-framed glass panes that kept out the weather while letting in the daylight. This alone was a mark of status that set them apart from the 90% of the population who were peasants. Now let us walk through the interior of a typical noble residence during the High Middle Ages. The floors were not bare stone, as you might expect, but covered with layers of fresh rushes and aromatic herbs. These rushes were changed regularly, and the servants scattered lavender, mint, and chamomile among them. When people walked across the floor, they released a pleasant fragrance that masked the less desirable smells of the era. The walls were hung with enormous tapestries that served both as insulation and as works of art. These tapestries depicted scenes of hunting, battle, romance, or biblical stories in vivid colors of red, blue, and gold. Weaving one tapestry could take a team of artisans several years to complete. A single piece was worth more than a peasant's entire village, including all the livestock and tools. The furniture in these rooms was carved from solid oak, walnut, or imported ebony by master craftsmen. Chairs and benches were padded with cushions stuffed with feathers or wool and covered in silk or velvet. Chests and coffers were not just for storage, but were also used as seating and even as temporary beds for guests. Every piece of furniture was adorned with intricate carvings of leaves, animals, or heraldic crests. The bed was the most important and valuable item in the entire household. A great lord's bed was a massive structure with 4 posts and a canopy that supported heavy curtains. These curtains were drawn at night to trap body heat and provide a sense of security and privacy. The mattress was stuffed with feathers or down, and the sheets were made of the finest linen imported from Flanders. Pillows were filled with soft goose feathers, and the blankets were woven from wool or even silk for the truly wealthy. Rich people changed their bed linens frequently, sometimes every week, which was astonishingly clean by medieval standards. They also had portable bathing tubs made of wood or copper that could be filled with heated water. Bathing was not the rare event that movies suggest, at least not for the upper classes. Most nobles bathed at least once a week, and many enjoyed a warm bath before important feasts or tournaments. They used soaps made from olive oil and ashes, and they scented their bathwater with rose petals and herbs. After bathing, they would anoint their bodies with expensive oils imported from the Middle East. Their hair was washed with egg whites and herbs, and they combed it with finely carved ivory combs. Hygiene among the rich was actually far better than what we often assume about the Dark Ages. They even had primitive forms of indoor plumbing in their grandest castles. Water was channeled through lead pipes from nearby springs or rainwater cisterns into the kitchens and bathrooms. Some castles had garderobes, which were essentially latrines built into the walls with a chute that dropped waste into a moat or pit. These garderobes were ventilated by small windows and often had a seat of polished wood or stone. It was not perfect sanitation, but it was miles ahead of what the poor had to endure in their dirt-floored hovels. Now let us turn our attention to the most enjoyable part of a rich person's day, the meals. Food was the ultimate display of wealth and power in medieval society. A noble family would consume vast quantities of meat, fish, bread, fruit, and sweets at every meal. They ate beef, mutton, pork, venison, rabbit, chicken, goose, duck, swan, peacock, and even small birds like larks and thrushes. Fish was equally abundant, including salmon, trout, pike, sturgeon, herring, and eel from local rivers and ponds. The wealthy also imported dried and salted cod from Norway and tuna from the Mediterranean. All of this meat and fish was heavily spiced with ingredients that were worth more than gold by weight. Black pepper, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, ginger, and saffron arrived from India, China, and the Middle East along perilous trade routes. A single pound of saffron cost the equivalent of a year's wages for a skilled craftsman. Only the rich could afford to sprinkle these precious spices generously over their roasts and stews. They also used almonds, raisins, figs, dates, and sugar, which was a luxury treat in those days. Sugar came from the Middle East in the form of hard loaves that had to be grated or pounded into powder. The rich used sugar to make elaborate sweets, marzipan figures, and candied fruits for dessert. Their bread was made from finely sifted white flour, which was expensive because it required multiple grindings and siftings. The poor ate dark, coarse bread made from rye or barley, but the rich insisted on pure wheat bread that was light and airy. Meals were served on silver or pewter plates, and the eating utensils included knives, spoons, and sometimes two-pronged forks. Forks were actually a late medieval invention that the rich adopted from the Byzantine court. The table was covered with a clean white cloth that was changed between courses. Wine was the drink of choice for the wealthy, and they consumed enormous quantities of it. Red wine from Bordeaux and white wine from the Rhine were highly prized and carefully stored in cellars. The wine was often spiced and sweetened with honey to create a drink called hippocras. Ale and beer were also consumed, but they were considered inferior to wine for the upper classes. The rich drank from goblets of gold, silver, or Venetian glass, which were often elaborately engraved with their family crest. Every meal was a theatrical performance that involved multiple courses served with great ceremony. The first course might include a roasted boar's head presented on a platter with an apple in its mouth. The second course could be a giant pie that, when cut open, released live birds that flew around the hall. The third course might feature a peacock that was skinned, cooked, and then redressed in its own feathers for display. These dishes were not just for eating, but for impressing guests and demonstrating the household's wealth and creativity. The rich employed entire teams of cooks, bakers, sauce makers, and confectioners who worked in vast kitchens. These kitchens had enormous hearths with spits that could roast several oxen at the same time. They also had ovens for baking bread and pastries, and cauldrons for boiling soups and stews. The amount of food wasted at a single noble feast was staggering by any standard. Leftover food was given to the poor at the gates, or fed to the dogs and pigs that roamed the castle grounds. But feasting was only one part of the rich person's daily life, and we must also consider their clothing and fashion. Medieval aristocrats were obsessed with their appearance, and they spent vast sums on their wardrobes. A nobleman's outfit might include a linen tunic, a woolen mantle, a silk surcoat, and a velvet cap or hood. His clothes were often trimmed with fur, such as ermine, mink, or sable, which were status symbols in their own right. He wore hose that fit tightly to his legs and shoes with long, pointed toes called poulaines, which sometimes curved upwards so sharply that they had to be tied to his knees with tiny chains. The length of the toe was actually regulated by sumptuary laws to prevent commoners from imitating the nobility. A lady's dress was even more elaborate, with layers of underdresses, overdresses, girdles, and flowing sleeves that swept the floor. Her gowns were made from the finest velvets, damasks, and brocades imported from Italy, Spain, and the East. She wore her hair in intricate braids or coiled under a veil or a silk headdress called a wimple. Her jewelry was a breathtaking collection of gold rings, ruby brooches, emerald necklaces, and pearl-studded hairpins. She also carried a small mirror of polished silver or steel, and she used cosmetics that were surprisingly sophisticated. Rich women whitened their faces with lead powder, rouged their cheeks with crushed beetles, and darkened their brows with soot. They plucked their hairlines to create high, domed foreheads, which were considered the height of beauty in that era. Perfume was another essential luxury, with scents of rose, jasmine, and musk imported from the Arab world. A wealthy lady would dab perfume on her wrists, her neck, and even the hem of her gown to leave a fragrant trail. The rich also indulged in lavish entertainment that went far beyond the simple village fares of the common folk. They enjoyed hunting, which was the sport of kings and the ultimate symbol of feudal privilege. Hunting parties would ride out with horses, hounds, and falcons to chase deer, boar, wolves, and even bears. Falconry was particularly popular among both men and women, and a trained falcon could cost a fortune. The rich also played chess, backgammon, and dice, and they gambled large sums of money on the outcomes. They listened to music performed by minstrels, jugglers, and troubadours who sang epic poems of chivalry and romance. They watched plays and pageants that were performed in their great halls by traveling troupes of actors. They also hosted tournaments where armored knights would joust against each other for glory and prizes. A major tournament could last for days and attract knights from all over Europe to compete in front of noble spectators. The rich sponsored these events not just for entertainment, but to display their patronage and political connections. They also commissioned illuminated manuscripts, which were hand-painted books that contained prayers, histories, or romances. These books were incredibly expensive because each page was made from vellum and decorated with gold leaf and vivid pigments. A wealthy duke might own a library of several dozen such volumes, which was a magnificent collection by medieval standards. Education was not neglected among the upper classes, especially in the later centuries of the period. Noble boys were taught to read and write by private tutors or sent to monastery schools and later to universities. They learned Latin, philosophy, law, and the art of rhetoric, which prepared them for careers in the church or government. Noble girls were also educated, though their curriculum often focused on household management, needlework, and music. However, some wealthy women became patronesses of learning and even wrote poetry and history themselves. The rich also traveled extensively, both for business and for pleasure, and their journeys were far from easy. They rode on horseback or in litters carried by servants, and they stayed at monasteries or other noble estates along the way. When they traveled, they brought their own furniture, tapestries, and even their own chefs and priests.
The roads were dangerous, so they traveled with armed escorts and heavily laden pack mules. Despite the perils, the rich maintained networks of correspondence with other wealthy families across Europe.
They exchanged letters, gifts, and betrothals that cemented alliances and expanded their influence. Marriage among the rich was rarely a matter of love, but rather a strategic transaction that united lands and fortunes. Daughters were married off as young as 12 to strengthen political ties and produce heirs. The dowry that a wealthy bride brought to her husband's family was a source of immense pride and financial security.
Widows of rich men often became powerful landowners in their own right, managing estates and wielding considerable authority. They could inherit property, serve as regents for their children, and even command armies in times of crisis. The role of women in rich families was therefore far from passive, and many medieval noblewomen were formidable figures.
We must also mention the merchants and bankers who amassed fortunes that rivaled the old feudal aristocracy. In cities like Florence, Venice, Bruges, and London, wealthy traders controlled the flow of spices, silks, and precious metals. These merchants built palatial homes with marble courtyards, stained glass windows, and frescoed ceilings painted by famous artists.
They funded the construction of cathedrals, bridges, and hospitals that are still standing today as monuments to their wealth. The Medici family of Florence is the most famous example of a merchant dynasty that became de facto rulers of a city-state. Their patronage of the arts laid the groundwork for the Renaissance that followed the Middle Ages.
It is also important to note that the wealthy were not exempt from the hardships and dangers of medieval life. They suffered from diseases like the plague, smallpox, and tuberculosis, just like everyone else. The Black Death of the 1340s killed rich and poor alike, and many noble families were wiped out in a matter of months.
Medical knowledge was primitive, and even the richest patient could expect little more than bleeding, purging, and herbal remedies. Childbirth was a particularly deadly risk for rich women, despite all their midwives and comfortable chambers. Infant mortality was staggeringly high, and many noble children did not survive their first year of life.
The rich also faced political dangers, including treason, assassination, and the constant threat of rebellion from their own barons. A nobleman could lose his fortune, his lands, and his head in a single failed uprising against the crown. Warfare was a constant reality, and the rich invested heavily in armor, weapons, and fortified castles to protect themselves.
Their suits of plate armor were custom-made and beautifully engraved, but they were also heavy and brutally uncomfortable. A knight could barely mount his horse without assistance, and he would sweat profusely inside his steel shell during a summer battle. The wealthy also lived under the watchful eye of the church, which demanded tithes and donations in exchange for salvation.
They built lavish monasteries and endowments to secure prayers for their souls after death. They also commissioned magnificent tombs and effigies that depicted them in full armor or in the robes of a pilgrim. Many nobles spent their final years in religious retreat, hoping to repent for the sins of their worldly lives. Yet, despite all these perils and uncertainties, the desire for luxury and display never dimmed among the medieval rich.
They continued to build ever grander castles, ever richer wardrobes, and ever more elaborate feasts down to the very end of the era. When the Middle Ages gave way to the Renaissance, the wealthy simply adapted their tastes to the new artistic and intellectual currents. So when we look back at those centuries, we should not see only darkness and squalor.
We should see a complex society in which money bought comfort, power, beauty, and a measure of security that the masses could only envy. The rich ate well, dressed well, lived in spacious homes, entertained themselves with art and sport, and took pride in their lineage.
They were not so different from the wealthy of today in their love of comfort and their hunger for status.
Their world was dangerous, dirty, and devout. But it was also vibrant, creative, and full of human ambition. And that, in the end, is the truest picture we can paint of how the rich lived in the Middle Ages. Every stone of their castles, every stitch of their clothing, every bite of their spiced meats tells a story of privilege and power.
It is a story that has been passed down to us through chronicles, paintings, and the very bones of their magnificent buildings. And it is a story that reminds us that wealth in any era has always been the great divider between the comfortable few and the struggling many. That is the legacy of medieval wealth, and it echoes in our own world more loudly than we might care to admit.